Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 139. Today's guest is Joshua Burton. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today on the show, I'm talking with poet Joshua Burton. Joshua Burton is a poet and educator from Houston, Texas, and he received his MFA in poetry at Syracuse University. He is a 2019 Tin House Winter Workshop Scholar, 2019 Juniper Summer Writing Institute Scholarship winner, 2019 Center for African American Poetry and Poetics Fellowship finalist, received the honorable mention for the 2018 Toy Darracott and Cornelius Eady Chapbook Prize, 2020 Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing finalist, 2023 Elizabeth George Foundation grant recipient, and a 2023 Disquiet Poetry Prize winner. His work can be found in Mississippi Review, Gulf Coast, The Rumpus, Conduit, Tri-Quarterly, Black Warrior Review, Grist, and Indiana Review. His chapbook Fracture Anthology is currently out with Ethel, and his debut poetry collection Grace Engine is out with the University of Wisconsin Press. I had the good fortune to read Joshua's new book, Grace Engine, recently, and I found it both interesting and moving. The poems ask what grace, and perhaps penitence, mean in a hostile and dangerous world of lynchings, mental illness, self-hate. One poem reminds us that grace does not belong to you, and yet the poems give grace nonetheless. And what does it mean to give away something that isn't yours? Perhaps something that can only be given because it isn't yours? The world of these poems has no solace in it, but the poems reach toward peace and beauty nonetheless, and I was really pleased to get to talk to Joshua about these poems for today's episode. There are links in the show notes to purchase copies of Grace Engine from Brazos Bookstore in Joshua's hometown of Houston, Texas, as well as from the Book Catapult here in San Diego and from bookshop.org. As always, though, if there's an independent bookstore in your own area, I highly recommend supporting it by buying your copy there. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Joshua Burton. I'm really glad that I had the chance to read your book. I really enjoyed it. I thought there was so much going on in these poems, but I was wondering if we could start with a reading?
Yeah. I was thinking of reading the title poem, Grace Engine. I love all the dead, both at the moment they unwet themselves of shame, and before that. The two men who think they will never die are two opposing laws. The will to live and the will to live a little longer. In a room in June full of bike parts, empty Bic lighters, and grease, the inn takes 10 minutes to open the door, and I am afraid for him. We are like brothers, like canyons, a fulmination between us, all red, all black. My real brother once, while half asleep, put a hot iron against his cheek, thinking it was the phone. It is hard to tell the truth, and it is hard to be in a room with so many words, the walls with holes the size of fists. Ann pulled the pistol from his jeans and placed it in the space between his ear and eye, like creating an extra sense and pointing to it. Once before, he told me if I were to suicide, he would piss on my grave. Again says, there would be a God at the end of me. Sada Shakur says, some people spell God with one O, while others spell it with two. To be in a room like this, full of white ghosts and ropes tied together in little black knots, is the opposite of being anywhere. After I fought the gun away from him, that hinge of metal between my fingers was human animal. Our fingers in the holes in the metal made us whole as a woman before machining out her second life.
Thank you. Something that I know from another interview that you did is that the title of this poem was accidental, that it came from a mishearing of your original title. And yet where it ends up is something that is such an evocative image, this idea of a grace engine. And one of the things that I found myself thinking a lot about as I was reading this collection, even, when I just first heard the title, is what is a grace engine? Is it an engine, like when we say a diesel engine, or we're saying an engine that runs on diesel, right? Or a steam engine or something like that. But we also can talk about like the engine of the economy or something, something that is producing something, right? So perhaps a grace engine is something that runs on grace, or is powered by grace, or is something that produces grace, or maybe both. That's sort of where I kind of wanted to start, is this idea of what you imagine a grace engine to be.
Yeah, I think it definitely changed over time. Like even when I first heard the title from that workshop, I was going to title the poem Grace and June. And then just professor misheard it as Grace Engine. And then he had me basically repeat it. And he was like, oh, I thought I heard Grace Engine. And then as soon as he said it, I was like, oh, I have to change this poem's title to that. Cause I was like, that's, even if I didn't fully process in my head yet, but I kind of knew like there was something special about that. I even had like other potential titles for the book at that point. And once I kind of sat with that for a while, I was like, wow, this is actually a poem that's very important to me, but also the title feels like it stretches beyond the poem as well. I feel like the poem, the title is doing like a certain amount of work with the poem, but then the title does even more work in like the grand scheme of the collection. So for me, I think while writing the book, for me, the Grace Engine was the poem, like a processing machine, or like this sort of thing you can funnel something through. And then it's like you funnel these like maybe traumas or like experiences that it's maybe hard to digest outside of the poem and outside and just in your real life. And then you kind of put it through the processing machine of the poem. You could potentially get healing on the other side. You can potentially have more clarity. There's one line in the book that says the poem is better than me. And I think about that a lot, of like there's something like spiritual in the poem that can process these things in like a really powerful way. But I think now, since the book is like almost out and hearing other people talk about Grace Engine, and even I think in your review as well, it started to actually open up my perspective of what that is, actually even more of like the potential of like a Grace Engine. I think you mentioned that it was like maybe a person could be a Grace Engine for someone else. I started thinking about that a lot. And I think there's people in the book that kind of are Grace Engines for the speaker, for me. Yeah, I think just like hearing like discussion and discourse on it, the little that's happened so far, it's really actually expanding my perspective of the Grace Engine. But for me, just while writing it, it was just kind of like that processing machine.
Yeah. Even just in the context of what you were saying just now of the poem being a Grace Engine, and you're sort of talking about it from the perspective of the poet, right? Of that other poem, A Confession, where you say the poem is better than me, or that you're using the poem or the process of writing poetry to sort of help you as the artist process things that have happened to you. But it also strikes me that the poem can produce grace for the reader as well, and possibly even for someone who's not the reader. Do you sort of know what I'm saying? Like the poem does something in the world, right? More than just what it does for oneself as the writer. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think that's always like the desire of like, all right, I think these poems are healing for me. So I was like, I always think that I hope they can like provide something for someone else, but it's really hard to tell because I think the experiences feel very particular, at least, like the perspectives feel very particular. So it's hard to know if you can like, people can relate or connect. But yeah, that's always like almost like the second goal. I think the first goal is for it to work for me and do healing for me and work for me. And then the second goal is to like do that for other people as well.
It's an interesting thing, this idea of relatability, because I feel like oftentimes the concept of relatability is one that's almost weaponized against artists who are of a marginalized background by people who are not, right? And whether that's along lines of race or gender or religion or sexual orientation or whatever, right? And yet I have always found, both as an artist myself and as someone who is an audience member for many artists, that when I come across something in someone else's work that is extremely and very obviously specific, not just necessarily specific to their community, but specific to themselves, that I am still nevertheless able to connect with. There is something kind of magical about that experience, you know?
Yeah, I wonder if it's like the relatability is actually like that emotion, that kind of ineffable emotion that the poem is either like involved in or like dispelling outwardly. And I think for me, that's why I kind of see like how I can connect with poets and like poems that feel like very, very distant from me, like on like a identity level of the poet in me. But there's like, sometimes it's like this one line or this one moment that has like this emotion attached to it that even if I haven't felt, I can kind of understand it on some level. And that feels like very like impactful for me. Yeah.
So grace is an idea that is running all through this book, and it's in the title. It's in the title of this poem. It's also in the title of really the majority of the poems in the collection have something to do with grace. And I guess one of the things I wanted to sort of start with is sort of like what that word means to you, not necessarily even that it might mean one thing, but for me, when I'm thinking about the word grace, there's obviously sort of the religious connotation of like the grace of God. And I feel that sense of the word is certainly operating in these poems. There's also the idea of grace in terms of like graceful movements or grace in an aesthetic sense. And also the idea of grace in sort of an interpersonal sense. But I'm wondering how you engage with that word for yourself.
Definitely think it was like a thing that kind of changed over time as well. And I'm starting to notice like a trend with my titles for books and stuff that usually are connected to like musicians. And I really loved Jeff Buckley in my late teens and early 20s, and had like a really connection to him. And he would talk about grace, but he would kind of like redefine it in ways. So I always thought that was very interesting of him, like taking this term that has like this heavy biblical connotation and then thinking about like love and death and these other things. So I think early on that intrigued me. And I actually been trying to work with the word grace for like many years, like even like in undergrad, I was thinking about like ways to turn it. And then later when I started writing this book, it kind of came back to me. But I think in the most sense of the book, it's kind of used as like a way to talk about honoring people. There's like giving Laura grace, giving Mary grace, giving Jim grace poems later in the book. I think those are definitely like thinking about like ways to honor these people. And I also think that the word for me might be connected to like some of these other like maybe aesthetics. There's a Japanese aesthetic called mono no awari. And I was like kind of obsessed with it for many years, like growing up and stuff. And I think it translates to like the empathy of things or like the sadness of things. So it's kind of about like these little moments in life that can kind of make you gasp. And sometimes it's like tragedy. Sometimes it's like really sad things. Sometimes it's like beauty that you're kind of gasping for. But it's like there's also these temporal moments. So maybe like the cherry blossoms, how they only bloom for like 2 weeks in Japan. It's this really stunning moment, but it's very brief. So it's sad because it's ending early, but it's also this very intense emotional state. And I almost wonder if like, cause I was always searching for like a way to like write about this emotion. And I was also just thinking about like, are there like Black aesthetics that is something similar for like a while? And I do wonder if I'm like maybe trying to use grace as like this almost Black aesthetic version of that mono no awari, how we sort of exist in these spaces where like in the book, there's a lot of sadness. But for me, I see a lot of like beauty, in some like the very subtle moments. And even just like some of these kind of poems that kind of feel a bit tragic. Like, the poem I just read feels like it's pretty, it's like heavy and it's a bit dark because it's talking about suicide, but it ends on this moment of like this shared space between this sort of trauma. And I think the shared space heals the two people in the poem in a way because they have like someone that can relate to them, but also have someone that can like understand them like on this deep level. So I'm thinking now that I wonder if another type of grace is like this sort of deep emotion through these Black people's lives in these different poems.
There's something about what you just said, this idea of understanding someone else, of this deep connection, of this deep knowing of someone else that really resonates with me. And I'm thinking about those three poems that you just mentioned, Giving Jim Grace, Giving Mary Grace, Giving Laura Grace. So, and for the listeners, these are poems that are about specific people who were lynched in the early part of the 20th century. So Jim McElheron, Mary Turner, and Laura Nelson and her son L.D. Nelson. You provide some of that context in the notes at the end of the book. And, when I was first thinking about these poems and the idea of giving these people grace, and I know this is something that you have talked about before, sort of the process of creating these poems and wanting to give these people grace. To me, there's something in there about the idea in the sort of religious context of grace as the path to salvation, or if we sort of separate it from like sort of the strictly Christian context of it, at least something like peace, something like transcendence. Like I can feel this reaching from the speaker of those poems to these people who met with such a brutal end. But taking this in the context of what you just said now about understanding someone, I find that really interesting, especially in the context of those three poems in specific. Those poems, as well as the poems that are about Royal Robertson and Adele Robertson, and the poems that are the erasure poems of William O'Neill's words. I feel like there is this really interesting tension happening in all of these poems because I feel like the speaker of these poems, of many of the poems, not just those poems, but of many of these poems, is in many ways sort of grappling with an internalized anti-Blackness or this sort of like relative privilege that he feels through describing, for example, like the difference between his life experience and his mother's life experience. And obviously the difference between his life experience and, sort of by inference, his life experience and these lynching victims' life experiences. So there is this sense of like, here are things that I couldn't possibly understand, right? But also that there's this attempt to understand and connect. And I guess I don't know if I'm like way off base about any of these things, but it feels like that idea of understanding is really at play and really important, especially in those poems that are engaging with real people. Does that, what does that spark anything for you or?
Yeah, it sparks a lot. I feel like there's a lot of like attempts in the book where I'm sort of trying to reach this understanding of like, who has the right to write about who. And at first I think I was under the assumption that, I'm not even sure if I disagree with this now either, but I was thinking that because I'm Black and these victims were Black, I think that connection is enough for me to write about it. And then the longer I kind of sat with that, and then also like, I guess the kind of failures that may have happened in those earlier poems in the book where I kind of talk about the lynchings in detail. Yeah, I call them failures because I think I'm still unsure whether the graphic detail was necessary. Part of me feels like they definitely were because I feel like telling that story is important, but also in the same breath, I feel like something Shoma Sharif said. She said to repeat that narrative and to like tell that story is to make them kind of relive their deaths. And it's like to reanimate the deaths in a way. It's kind of harmful, I think, in the same breath while you're sort of giving this awareness of like these things happen and these why I'm talking about these things because they have to stop happening. So there's a conflict there. So going over these kind of pretense that our connection to Blackness is enough for me to kind of write about them and maybe start second guessing that and thinking about, I wonder if us being Black and being family, one of those two things together would be enough for me to write about them. So there's like in Giving Laura Grace, I talk about, you are not my mother. I have no moral contract with you. And for me, the moral contract is like that blood contract that's kind of unspeakable. And I'm almost trying to like pull away from that preconceived notion that I have authorities to write about her in this way. So I'm wrestling with a lot there because I never come to a conclusion. Thinking of the kind of connecting. The poem ends with the speaker just reaching into the dirt and trying to get as close to her as possible. And that reaching over, it's like the kind of ending point of like what I think that connectiveness is. There's a lot of just wrestling of like, what is family? Because in those poems, I'm like kind of just supposing Mary Turner with my grandmother and my mother. And then one of the other poems, I'm just supposing Jim McElheron with my grandfather. So it's like a blurring of like lines of like me questioning myself kind of throughout the process of thinking about just because I'm Black, I know I can, doesn't mean I'm unable to like do harm in these ways. So I'm just like kind of wrestling with these things, going through these processes and thinking about connection. And I just kind of play with the idea of like, are they family? When I read them, they felt like family to me. And is that enough to like write about them in this way, in this very, very direct way? Or was it more that I should be considering about like that human connection and about like Blackness, like is Blackness enough to like connect us in this way? So yeah, it's just wrestling with a lot, but like never coming to like a true conclusion, just kind of like sitting in these ideas and these thoughts and these like failures and wanted to like kind of sit in them. And I think, that felt like important for me to kind of sit with these failures in different ways in the book.
What that reminds me of is, a few years ago, I did a roundtable episode with 3 other literary podcasters, with David Naiman, Rachel Zucker, and Tuji Tahat. And one of the questions that I posed was, when talking to guests on our shows, when speaking to someone across a difference, like how do we handle that? Because I always feel that it's important to have a certain sensitivity about that kind of thing. And I remember Rachel said something really interesting, that the times when she has gotten into the most trouble on her show, or I think that she meant on her show, is not when she is being insufficiently mindful of a difference, an obvious difference, or speaking to someone across a difference, was when she has made an assumption that she and her guest are the same in some way. Like both of us are women, or both of us are Jewish, or something like that, Yeah. And that strikes me as very similar to what you're saying here, that this idea of just because you have in common your Blackness doesn't necessarily mean that you are the same, or that you are sort of entitled to those stories. And yet, when we're talking about grace, right, there's something about that concept, both about, wanting to honor the person about whom you are speaking, or to whom you are speaking, and also acknowledging that wanting to honor those people, that can be something personally important, and also in the way that the poem lives in the world, may be something important on a wider scale, but also in acknowledging the failures of that connection, that there's an opportunity there to really beat oneself up, and yet there's also, if we're talking about grace, that's something that one could also give to oneself, having some sort of understanding that, well, I am human, impact matters, but intention kind of matters also. And, you sort of know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think even having like the kind of, the two polar ends sort of poems in the first part and second part of the book of like the Elegy for Threats with Grace, which has like the first kind of retelling of Jim McElheron and his death. And then the other side has giving Jim grace. And these two things kind of exist as like these two pools that are happening. They're both trying to give him grace in different ways. And then it has, Grace and Separation, which references the photo of Laura Nelson, and then has the detailed lynching of Mary Turner. And then they have these other two poems, giving Mary grace and giving Laura grace, that tries to be these kind of two ends. So it tries to show that like there's different ways to kind of give grace. 'Cause even in those giving grace poems, they're like, even those are like different attempts kind of at grace, and me just kind of working through those processing things. Yeah, because even though I call those earlier poems like kind of failures, I still know the work they did for me on like a personal level. And I know like they have like their place in their own right. But I do think there's a other side where I feel like it's important to be considered, because I do think writers can sometimes be a little loose with like that sort of thing of like that kind of personal responsibility thing. And when I first started writing the poems for this collection, even back then, I was kind of checking myself to not do that. Then like the third and fourth poem in, I kind of did it. So I was like, even with that, like I still kind of wasn't fully doing that work as strongly as I should. But like I said, I do still feel like there's a lot in those poems that are very helpful. And for me, it's just a lot about processing shame in different ways. And, yeah, especially for, Elegy for Threats with Grace. Like, I don't think I've ever written a poem that has like transformed me as much as that poem has.
It's interesting, because I feel like, in the past 5-ish years, I've heard a lot of conversations about, who has the right to write what, and often this is in the context of white writers writing persona poems in voices that maybe they shouldn't be entitled to. And what strikes me the most about this conversation that you and I are having is that this is something that you are really questioning, and even that you engage with in the poems themselves. Like in the opening lines of Giving Laura Grace, you talk about, like the time I mistook a bridge for a tree, I am waiting for the poem to correct me, which to me sounded like a reference to the opening line of Grace and Separation, where there's a photo of Laura Nelson, a rope between her and a tree. And there's also a line in Giving Laura Grace that says, I wrote to you once before, Laura, and failed. And so not just in the conversation that we're having, but in the poems themselves, you as the poet are grappling with this question of like, is this a story that I am entitled to work with in this way? What's ironic about that is that the people who most need to be asking the question are the ones who are least likely to do so, it seems. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I also think I kind of had a lot of practice or like, thinking about this stuff because, in undergrad, it was like my third year just writing poetry. I had this idea to just want to write about my mother and then also write like in her voice. So I had the idea to want to do it, and I asked her if she'd be okay with it. And she said yes. And then she gave me her journals, like 30 years worth of journals she's been collecting. She was like, you can use these to create your poems with. So that book, was actually my chapbook named Faction Anthology that came out last year. But I worked on that for like 5 years. And throughout that entire process, like a majority of those poems are in her voice. And I'm like asking that question the entire time of like, do I have the authority to write about this? And, is this okay? And, I kept coming back to that. I think it was because I got her consent, and I would like show her every poem afterwards and stuff. So it was like this open sort of relationship back and forth with it the entire time. But every like few months, I would constantly like question myself to be like, maybe, is this too much? Am I overstepping, and just things like that. So I think just writing that collection kind of, trained me like in my early 20s to kind of just think about these questions and like like on a normal basis, and just kind of like have to like constantly prepare myself for this book. Cause I think that book just kind of gave me the blueprint in a lot of ways, even though I still felt like it was still very difficult to kind of work through these things. But I do think that helped me a lot. Yeah.
I mean, it is in, taking the time to ask these questions is an act of care, right? There's something that I wanted to talk about the erasure poems a little bit. It was something that I was thinking a lot about, the way that erasure poems in particular can work and why these felt so different to me from when I've seen other erasure poems, like I've seen Japanese American poets do erasure poems around like the executive order that, imprisoned, hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans during World War II. And that's an act where it's like you're taking the words of power and making them mean something different, right? But I feel like the engagement with the original text and the act of erasure and what the result is so unique to like the specific text that's being worked with and the result and the motivation for it. You know what I mean? I kind of wanted to get your thoughts about your engagement with those texts, with that one text, because you created three different poems out of the same text. And I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on that. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the interesting thing about like those poems that kind of start with the death machine ruin and then kind of chips away after that. So the original like text, like if you look at the first poem, it has like the lines crossed out on them. The two prose blocks are they actually aren't like a found text. I actually wrote those. So those are like two persona pieces in the voice of William O'Neill. And I wrote, that's actually the first poem I wrote, like, when, like, knowing I was going to create, like, Grace Engine, at least had the idea of the book, but not the title and not much else. It's like, I wrote those two prose blocks. And then I sat with it and I was like, I don't feel like this poem is doing enough. I feel like it's, like, trying to get at what I feel, but it's not, like, doing enough. So I did the erasure of that text. I can't remember if it was the blacked out one or the whited out one first. Then I did it and I was like, oh, I feel like this is actually getting that closer to what I think, well, even though I'm projecting what I felt like may have been why William O'Neill took his life. And then I was like, oh, I think I can do this again because I actually think, I actually feel like there's so much I can do in this. So I did like the second one. And then I was like, oh, this is actually really interesting. Because I still just felt like that first prose block was just like, just not, the two prose blocks just wasn't doing enough. So then maybe like in the last year of creating the book, I was like, I think I could even like do another one here. So I did the crossed out one after that. So I just created the original text and I was like, I like the idea of like, every time you chip away at it a little bit more, it reveals more of like what led him to like, what he really felt. Because when I watched some of the interviews, he would say things that felt like contradictory. Like he'd talk about how like great of a man Fred was, but then he'd talk about the Black Panthers being problematic and being like not good in the community. And I was like, I don't think you believe some of the stuff you're saying. And it was just like, I was like, well, and he said he didn't regret what he did. So it was just like, and I read like the article about like his actual death, like when he was with his uncle that day and stuff like that. So yeah, I was just trying to understand what I think he was hiding with each erasure. And like, I guess formally, I was trying to think of like, all right, what was it? If I can think of like what it was that led him to like his end, was it like this idea of like him not connected with blackness? So it was like the black bars that's crossed out, or was it whiteness that killed him? That's why the other poem was whited out. So I was like, just trying to think about like, I think there's something deeper at and more nuanced than what he's actually saying in these interviews. And I think, even just the impetus to just write the poem at all is because it was like, the summer right before I started Grace Engine, I was just reading upon the Black Panthers and learned about them and learned about Fred Hampton. Then of course you learn about Fred Hampton, you learn about William O'Neill and like what he did. And I was just like so angry and I was just like, honestly like disgusted. And I was just like, had such like kind of like hate towards him of what he did. And I read up on him and I found out he committed suicide. And then I immediately kind of like felt sorry for him. And then I realized there was maybe something else going on there. And I think that what made him like an interesting person to like try to like write a persona on, because I was like, oh, there's something here that's like, that I think it was like anti-blackness that he just didn't expose or wasn't upfront about. And then you connect that to like my upbringing of kind of dealing with something similar. So I was like, oh, I feel like the word that came to mind was connection, but I don't know if I'm thinking about the word a little bit differently. I think because we've been kind of analyzing it in different ways, but it was like that sort of connection there between like me and him and just that small space. So I was like, and I think you mentioned this in the review too about like, I think that one thing made me think about like, I wonder if he is even worthy of grace. And it's created a lot of complications in my head about it. And I think, so I wanted to like kind of think about him in these ways, but then every sort of version I did, I was like, I think this version is doing some work, but I think there's more work to be done. So it just ends on like, he's saying, I am money. So it's just like this sort of breaking it down to like him not even able to separate himself for this thing that he did these things for. And yeah, I was just trying to see, like, I wonder if there's like something that's underneath and so underneath that he wouldn't even want to admit to himself. And like who knows if that's like even true, because yeah, and who knows if he even committed suicide, because I heard that there's actually like more information that he possibly could have been killed by the FBI because he was speaking about it. So there's like, of course, other stuff there that could be a little bit more complicated, but just under the pretense that he actually did take his life, is made me think about it in this a lot more ways, because I think it automatically made me feel sympathy towards him, even though he did this really horrific thing.
I had not realized that was that was your text that you were altering to make these poems. So that definitely puts a different spin on things. What really sticks out to me about when you're talking about this is this idea of coming back to it over and over again, because I feel like repetition is something that comes up a few different times throughout the collection, whether it is like repeating this thing with these poems or returning to, you write to Laura and then you come back and write again, or in a few of the poems, like, for example, in Grace Division, it opens with the line, "I like repeating myself, that turn of the glass to find your print." In the later poem, "As I grace myself into a rephrasing freedom, I am repetition." And at times throughout the collection, there are instances of repetition, like in The Hearing We Inherit, "I love you all and love you and love you and love you." In A Constant Conjunction, there's that whole 2-page spread that is, the phrase "forgive Joshua," and then it's repeated over and over again and also modulated through across the pages. And I'm interested to sort of, hear what repetition, like, I like repeating myself. What is it that you like about the repetition? Or I am repetition. How does engaging with repetition operate for you as a poet?
I think on like a stylistic way in the book, I did like those sort of kind of the polar sort of ends on each side. The first section is called "I," and the second section is called "We." And I feel like I wanted to kind of display like a growth in a lot of the repetition. So like when there's like the poem, I think "Royal" is like in the first part, and the poem in the second part of the book, it's like in the voice of his wife. And I think like with that, I think the Royal poem is like very kind of similar to the William O'Neill, where it's like this figure who's like, from maybe what you can read about him, not a great person, kind of, but also like plagued with like mental illness that kind of led him to these really awful misogynistic thoughts. But then in the second half, there's his wife speaking, and it's this very like loving way, and it humanizes him in a way. And I think it's like doing something with this processing that I think is really important, of like, there's maybe like a centralized I in the first part of the book that I think may have been like self-indulgent. So even when those poems that talks about the lynchings in the first parts, I do wonder if the speaker is centering themselves more than the people that are lynched in ways that maybe like unknowingly. And then when you revisit it with the repetition, you kind of can like almost flip that. Like they're centering these individuals and kind of standing on the outside and trying to like show honor to them in different ways. And I think in another way, I kind of think that repetition and the act of repetition is like an act of love. I think, yeah, to like have that familiarity and to come back to someone and something is like a sign of love. And you can kind of have trust in it once it kind of comes back to itself, I think.
So we're getting close to time for this segment, but there's one more thing that I wanted to talk about, and that's the sort of the idea of shame. That's something that you've brought up already in this conversation. It's something that you've talked about in other conversations, like when you were on the Bread and Poetry podcast, you talked about a feeling of shame that had to do with the original poems that you had written being failures, and then having to work through that to get to a different place, and how that was a helpful thing for you. I feel like, as much as grace is this central running theme throughout this collection, shame also is, because there are so many instances throughout these poems of the speaker of the poem expressing shame or expressing a desire for forgiveness or saying, I'm sorry, or that there is this sense of shame about the internalized anti-Blackness that the speaker talks about. There are...
there's one line, I'm sorry, but I think hurting something Black became a habit. That might...
Yeah, that is one of the ones that I had noticed. And even, one of the later poems is titled A Confession, and some of the lines that I pulled out of that one that you mentioned, the poem is better than me. And as I try not to carry names as weapons or myth them into meaning, I must still learn myself alive. Trauma, like the poem, must look both ways to look at itself. And then the third line that I pulled out was, I must be forgiven somewhere for thinking Blackness was the curse. And the title of that poem, A Confession, it makes me wonder about whether or not this collection can be seen as a type of confession. And obviously, like in Christianity, in Catholicism, confession is a really big part of that practice of religion, of, confessing one's sins and being forgiven, having to atone for them. And obviously, like, poetry has a long history of confessional as well. But I'm not sure exactly what the precise question here is, but this concept of shame running through these poems, shame and grace perhaps being two sides of the same coin, and whether or not the act of engaging with these concepts through these poems, it can function as a type of confession, as a pathway to grace. Does that spark anything for you?
Yeah, kind of going back to when I mentioned that I think Elegy for Threats with Grace, the act of writing that poem was probably like one of the most transformative experiences for me. And a big part of that was me kind of thinking about shame in that poem a lot, about having anti-Blackness at all, having those feelings at all, and then kind of thinking about that just opposed to these brutal murders that happen of people dying because they're Black. I was trying to explore shame in that, but I think the act of writing it helped relieve a lot of that shame. So I think a lot of the shame that's talked about in the book, for me, the poem as like a grace engine helped process so much of that shame. Like there's a poem at the end of the first part of the book named A Consequence Passing. And how I think of that one is it's basically like a shame litany. I'm just going to talk about all these things I'm ashamed of and just put them next to each other. It's talked about these really things that are embarrassing, like growing up with internalized homophobia and things like that. I'm just going to put everything in this poem, just all these shameful things, and try to process them through that poem in different ways. So I do think, yeah, like you said, it's grace and shame kind of do these sort of central themes. But I also think that the ways that the shame is kind of spoken and kind of written down is almost like it kind of goes through this, just this sort of machine where you're sitting with this poem, you're going through the act of writing it, and you're reading it to yourself, and almost like that whole act itself helps relieve a lot of that shame and helps you kind of sit with it and helps you maybe almost forgive yourself in a way.
It strikes me that, something that I have thought a lot about in the past decade or so, because shame is such a central experience of my own life. And a lot of that comes from understanding racism in new ways, understanding the ways that someone can be a victim of racism and also commit racism, understanding things like patriarchy, understanding, new things about, what it means to be an American, for example. I mean, shame is something that comes along with all of that. I feel like if one has any self-awareness and any form of empathy whatsoever, that one can't help but have a certain amount of shame that comes as a process of learning these things. And so much of the sort of ills that we face as a society at this moment have to do with this inability by certain people to confront their own shame. And even though the speaker of these poems is grappling with and often presenting his shame, the process of, like, as you're saying, the process of creating the poems, turning that shame into poems, it's such a much healthier way of dealing with it than going through the certain things like, denial or making laws so that you can't talk about certain things in schools anymore. Or, and it's like, shame is something that we all have to deal with on some level or another, because none of us is free of wrongdoing, or whether that's our own wrongdoing or the wrongdoing of our ancestors or people that we identify with. And yet it's the people who most need to reckon with that shame that seem like incapable of doing so. Whereas someone like you or I might have a certain amount of shame that comes from that same learning, whether it's like, confronting our internalized homophobia, that may have been normalized when we were younger, but is no longer okay, and probably shouldn't ever have been okay. There's a shame associated with that. And so what are you going to do with that, right?
Yeah.
Like you and I might, write a poem about it, and by doing so, process it, and also give the reader an opportunity to confront that and process it as well. Maybe we're not the ones that need to be doing that quite. I mean, everybody needs to, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And the thing about people that like avoid, it's like they don't even want to admit that there's a potential for shame even there. Mm-hmm. It's like they don't really have the conversation that, and if they are called out about it, they'll be like, it wasn't me, or I'm not a part of this, and that sort of thing. So it's a complete turn away from even like wanting to even say that shame's even in the room or has the potential of being in the room. So yeah, it's not even nowhere near trying to engage with it whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to move into the second segment. So let's take a quick break and then come back for that. So for the second segment, I always invite my guests to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
I think the importance of mythology and like creative work. So maybe like literary work or even like some other creative work. I think I've been thinking about mythology a lot over the last like few years, and just been seeing it in so many different places. The more I think about it, I'm just realizing that so many places are kind of using it in like really interesting ways.
So what's at the top of your mind about mythology right now?
So kind of going back to Grace Engine, I think there's been like, so with some of those later poems is thinking about like ways to honor people. And it's kind of going through different ways. So in giving Mary Grace the type of honor is trying to just give her agency to speak. So it's asking a bunch of questions. And then giving Laura Grace is kind of same with the idea that maybe the best way to honor her is to let her rest, and not expect anything from her. So it's just saying, just kind of sit there and just wait for nothing, which means just not wait or expect any response. Those are two ways, like, where I was like sitting with. And then like, another way that I thought about very, very, very near the end of Grace Engine, like, when the book was like pretty much complete, of like thinking that potentially another way to honor people is to create mythology around them, or have these mythology as like this sort of way of where people can sort of be eternal in some ways. I think I've been thinking about like eternal life and things like that, and I was religious when I was like in my teens, but then it kind of faded away, and now I'm pretty much an atheist. So I don't really believe in heaven in like that sense. So I was thinking like, I wonder if like mythology and storytelling is just like this way that can like give people eternal life and give them some sort of like, I don't know, like something that is like definitely for people that maybe died in these kind of tragic ways. One of these ways to just kind of give them grace, hide them in this really interesting way that can like create these myths around them. So I was just thinking about that a lot, like with like newer work of like, I wonder if there's mythology in these stories and of these people that existed that can kind of create around them. Think about maybe like the oral tradition of like one of these stories can be passed down and just like this way for them to always be here through these stories.
I mean, certainly legend and song and things like that have been used by lots of cultures throughout history to sort of immortalize important figures, right? And, when I think about mythology, probably because I'm a product of the American education system, the first things that I tend to think of are European mythologies, like, the Greek and Roman myths. And certainly there's a lot of that happens in that sort of canon of stories. Another thing I think about with mythology is how myths and legends and these stories that get passed down are very often about understanding the ways to be in the world, like telling you either how things came to be the way that they are, or what the proper way to be in the world in relation to, whether it's relation to the gods or relation to nature or to each other, that these myths are providing a function in the world.
Yeah.
And then the third thing that I kind of think of is how typically when we're thinking about myths and legends and things like that, we are thinking about these figures that are larger than life, whether that's because they're a deity or because they're some heroic figure. And there's something really interesting to me about the idea of taking these figures who many people don't even know about, somebody like Jim McElheron or Laura Nelson or Mary Turner. Many people in the United States don't know the history of lynching at all, and certainly not about these three specific individuals. And so the idea, and within their lifetimes, they were obviously not treated as larger than life heroic figures, or, even people of value to many of the people that, certainly to the people who ended their lives. And so there's something kind of, I don't know if subversive is the right word, but something like it's like an act of declaration of power or something to take people like these and turn them into the focus of a myth. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Near the end of Grace Engine, I think it's in Confession, there's like a short reveal that my grandfather's siblings were lynched. And throughout the entire process of writing Grace Engine, I had no idea of this. And my dad just dropped it on me like my last year of writing the book, I had no idea about this. I was writing about lynchings and sitting with these three individuals for a very long time. And then he just told me about it one day, and I was like, how have you not told me this? Because I've been writing about this and researching this so much for the last few years. So it felt but I couldn't, it was hard to find information about them, because really hard to find information about a lot of people at that time. But one of the other sort of impetus of wanting to write about mythology is learn as much as I can about them, and then creating mythologies about them. Like you said, these people who probably no one alive still today knew them, or even at that time, it was in Birmingham, Alabama in the 40s when they got lynched. So it's just people that were kind of wiped away from history and was probably only remembered by their family and things like that. So yeah, just writing mythology around these people, trying to find just a name or something, or a photo or something like that, and then just taking what you can from that photo, creating mythology around them, and then also making the mythology completely separate from their death, I think is another important thing that would be important for me to talk about them outside of the lynching and try to give them agency outside of that as well.
It seems like something that would be sort of changing the perspective and narrative to do that. Yeah.
So something that Solmaz Sharif told me back in 2019 was so she read the Apology for Threats with Grace and Grace and Separation at the 10 House workshop. And she told me about this idea about the punctum, and it was in Camera Lucida by Roland Barthes, and he talks about when you look at a photo, there's something that punctures you that is very, very specific to you, and you kind of put your kind of past experiences on that photo, what makes this one thing stand out to you. She was basically kind of talking about the lynching photo of Laura Nelson. And she said that she thinks that we can actually write about these people who are lynched, and these people that kind of died in these horrific ways without even mentioning the lynching. So she kind of gave me that sort of task or later in the book. So that's where all the Giving Grace poems came from. It came from that idea of like, I'm going to write about these people and not mention the lynching at all. And she felt that the truth of that would kind of come in some other way. So it's not, we didn't necessarily have to kind of bring it out. So I was thinking that if I can speak about these people, not even like reference the lynching, it gives them like this type of agency that at the end of their lives that they didn't have. So it's like making mythologizing them and sort of these sort of mythical figures and showing them that this thing that happened to you isn't you. You're so much more than this, basically.
I kind of wonder, like, you know, again, like when I'm thinking about the myths that I grew up learning about, whether that's, you know, the ancient religious myths or even something like the stories about, you know, the founding of the United States, for example. Largely the stories that we learn about in elementary school are incomplete at best. But these are sort of our national legends.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm thinking about is the way that the reason that they survive, the reason that people tell these stories is because there's something foundational about one's sense of self, about one's sense of, identity within a community, that the myth provides some kind of framework to sort of understand yourself in.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting idea to sort of, you know, if I think about what the American myths are, to expand that sort of canon of stories to include stories more like the ones that you're talking about here, and what might that accomplish for us as a community, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. One myth in particular that I was really like struck by when I first was hearing about it. So, in Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, she kind of talks about the book. She talks about the idea of the book came from her kind of always hearing these stories growing up about like flying Africans. So basically like Africans would be enslaved. Then when they're in bondage, some will actually fly back over the ocean back to Africa. And she said that she would always hear these stories, and then when she started researching them and asking people about them, people would either say they never seen it, but they know someone that said they seen it, or they heard like rumors or something like that. But other people will say they actually seen it. Like a few people said they actually seen it happen. And that story just like, I thought it was like so powerful and so beautiful, because it was just like you said, it's like there's something we can take from that. Of like, it gives us like agency to say that we can overcome this. Basically, it's like we have the ability to fly, we have the ability to like grow wings. It has like these beautiful like sort of symbolism in there, and it gives people who are like in the worst of conditions like the sort of narrative where they can possibly like yeah, it has that hope in there somehow that does like this extra work. And I can kind of maybe pivot to the artistic piece too that I mentioned too, because it's kind of connected to this as well. Is it fine for me to kind of?
Yeah, sure. No problem.
Okay. Yeah. Because the album I was kind of thinking about that. I think it was maybe the second time I've kind of heard about a myth that really stuck with me. So the rapper Lupe Fiasco, he has an album called Jogas Wave, and the album's like kind of broken into two parts. The first part of the album is sort of about this sort of, it's a mythology around these enslaved people called the long chains. And the story goes that they're like on the slave ships. And then, no one knows how, but the ship sank. But these group of enslaved Africans could breathe underwater. So they basically created like an underground civilization. And they would just, basically, if they see a slave ship passing, they would just throw these long chains and crash all these slave ships. And then once that happens, the people on the boat think they're going to drown, but I think only the white people drown. And then but the Africans, when they're put on the water, the long chains would tell them that like basically just breathe. You can breathe underwater. So it's just it's like this sort of heroic story that's like very similar to like just the flying. It's creating these warrior like narratives around these groups of people that were basically, all these things was taken from us. Like, and what I found just so powerful about these two stories is it gives so much agency and it gives so much like power to us. And so it gets me thinking about these individuals who were lynched, like from in my family and also not in my family, about like, I wonder, even though I don't think the mythology will be connected to the lynchings, like I said, but I think with these individuals, I'm just curious about like the potential of mythology that could be given to them, even just as a way of to show them honor, show them grace as they are.
Yeah. Well, you anticipated my final question, but this doesn't seem like a terrible place to end. So thank you so much for talking with me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, there are links in the show notes for you to purchase copies of Grace Engine. If you enjoyed our conversation today, then I think this book just might be one to check out, and I highly recommend it. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me. The music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with the podcast or poetry lover in your life. And if you really want to do me a solid, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are links in the show notes for that. And you can find all of the show's contact info, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechannelopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back next month with a new conversation, so do be sure to come back for that. Until then, remember, keep the channel open.